We've seen how to create cell arrays and how to concatenate them, but what we haven't seen is how to access the elements of the arrays. Well, just like we do with double and care and logical arrays, we use parentheses to access the elements of the array. Here, if we had an array A and we had index vectors, R index for the row index and C index for the column index, that would access the corresponding rows and columns of the array. Now we have to remember that a cell array is thought of as an array of containers, and there happen to be contents in each container, but it is an array of containers. So the elements of the array are the containers. The parentheses refers to the elements of the array. Therefore, the result of such a reference is the containers with the accompanying contents. For example, this is a cell array that we've been referring to over the last few slides. If we make the reference A21 with parentheses, that means the 2-1 container with its contents. So notice that the container is what comes along with this reference. So the class of A21 is not double. It's not the 2x2 double array that is the contents of that, but it actually is a cell array. The size of it is 1x1. It's a single container. We can also use the colon, which represents, if we use it in the first index, all rows. So here we're referring to all rows, second column of the container array A. So that grabs that 2x1 array of containers. So the class of this will be a cell array, and in fact the size of it is 2x1. It's a 2x1 array of containers. Let's confirm this in Matlab. Let's start by recreating the array. When we access the 2-1 element, we get the display that reminds us it's a cell array, only showing a condensed version of the contents. In fact, by checking the class, we confirm that it's a cell array, and by checking the size, confirm that it's a 1x1. Even though the contents in the 2-1 entry, the contents right here, is a 2x2. We can also look at the second column. And since the array is an array of containers, the second column is also an array of containers, displayed as we expect. The class of it is cell, and the size is 2x1. Let's look at this parentheses referencing one more time on the class info example. Remember, class info is a 1x3 cell array whose contents are the student's name, the student's ID number, and the student's scores. If we refer to the first element, remember that we're actually getting the first element of the array, which is a container containing the character string Jack Jackson. So therefore this is equal will return false, because class info open parentheses 1 is the container whose contents is Jack Jackson, but it's not the character string Jack Jackson. The size of class info 1, again, class info 1 is a 1x1 cell array. So the size will be 1x1. It will not be 1 by the number of elements in the character string Jack Jackson. The class of class info 1 will not be char. Instead, it will be cell. Remember, parentheses refers to the elements of the array, and the array is a cell array. Therefore, its elements are cells, or containers as we've been calling them. Nevertheless, we can use the array indexing to rearrange the order of the elements of the array. Here we're asking for the third element of the array, the first element of the array, followed by the second element of the array. So what this will do is this will rearrange the container array, and the first container will now be the container with the scores. The next will be the container with the name, and finally it will be the container with the student ID number. Indeed, that's what happens. We can also use some familiar constructions that we've used before. End refers to the last element of the array. So this will be a single container array whose contents is the 1x5 array of scores. So clearly, the parentheses referencing gives the container and the contents, but not just the contents. A natural question is, how do we access just the contents of a given container, not the entire container itself? In order to reference the contents of a cell and not the cells themselves, we use a contents reference. Rather than parentheses, which references the elements of the array, which are the cells, curly brackets reference the contents of a cell or the contents of a container. For instance, with class info, this 1x3 cell array, using a curly bracket and a reference 1, we do obtain the contents of the first cell, which is the character string Jack Jackson. Class info curly 1 is a 1x12 char array. Similarly, class info with a curly bracket reference 2 pulls out the contents of the second container, which in this case is the student ID number, that 8-digit scalar double. Finally, the contents of the third container are the 1x5 array of scores. Comparing the contents reference of the first container with the character string Jack Jackson returns true, and comparing the contents reference of the second container with what we know to be the student ID number also returns true. Let's try this in Matlab. Let's start by reconstructing class info and making a contents reference of the first entry. It looks like we've extracted the character string Jack Jackson. Let's remember what it looks like when we make an array reference. Well, that also looks like we've extracted the character string Jack Jackson. And it really requires remembering exactly what the rules are for the manner in which Matlab displays these objects. So the safer thing is to check the class of class info open curly 1. This will be a character string, whereas the parentheses reference is a cell array. If we check the size of class info with the curly reference, we should be getting the character string Jack Jackson. That should be 1x12. And if we check the parentheses, that's the cell array, so that will be 1x1. Similar thing holds for the second entry. We obtain the student ID number, and the third entry, we obtain the scores. Let's again look at what would it look like with a third element reference. And there we see the typical display for a cell array where the contents are shown in a condensed form. Notice the difference. The simple convention to remember for these references are parentheses always refers to the array elements. And for cell arrays, the array elements are the containers. That's why when we use a parentheses reference on a cell array, we extract the containers along with their contents. For cell arrays, curly brackets are used to refer to the contents of an array element and not the array element itself. We'll see in a few slides that the same convention is also used for assignments, although up till now we've only been talking about references. For cell arrays, there's some possibilities of multiple layers of referencing. Any valid reference may immediately follow a cell contents reference. The references are simply applied sequentially. The innermost contents reference is applied to the variable, and then the remaining references are applied to the retrieved contents. Suppose V is a cell array, and we consider this expression. The way to interpret this is first consider the contents reference applied to V and storing that result in a temporary variable. And then the element reference is applied to the temporary variable, giving the final result. For 3 or more references, we simply break this into 2 steps and work recursively if needed, starting with the innermost contents reference. For example, here's a situation with 2 contents references followed by an element reference. Think of this as first doing the contents reference on V, storing that result in a temporary array. And then the temporary array is subjected to a second contents reference and another element reference, which can be handled by the box to the left where we described how that happens. Let's look at how this works on class info. Here's an example with a contents reference followed by an element reference. The first contents reference retrieves the contents of the first cell. This would be the 1x12 character array Jack Jackson. At that point, that character array is subjected to a element reference retrieving the 6 through end elements of the array. That simply gives the character string Jackson. Similarly, in this expression, the contents of the third cell are retrieved. That is the 1x5 scores array. And then an element reference is applied to that, asking for the first, third, and fifth scores. This, of course, gives the array 82, 64, and 99. We'll have a quiz on this to test your understanding of this material.